I'm Lisi Keeker, a longtime studio owner turned founder here at Studio Grow. Just a few years ago, I was building my studios the hard way. So I didn't have the team, the budget, or most importantly, the time. Now, if you speed up to today, I sold my wildly profitable studios in the mid 7 figures while serving my community in ways I could have only dreamed. Now I work with thousands of boutique fitness studio owners in over 40 countries, and I am so blessed to share some of the best tested strategies for our industry every single week. I created this podcast so you'd always have clear, actionable processes, tried and tested advice, and just some good old-fashioned inspiration. So you can take steps to grow your studio and turn it into a powerhouse empire just like I did. If you're a studio owner who's ready to impact your community and see major growth in the process, or you're prepping to become one, then you're in the right place. So let's kick this off, shall we?
Hi, welcome back to the Business of Boutique Fitness podcast. I'm Heather Garrick. I am the CMO of the Bespoke program here at Studio Grow. I'm really excited to be joined today by Caroline. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I'm Caroline Plambeck, team captain of the Grow Your Studio Profitably program here at Studio Grow. And today we're chatting about when to pivot or rebrand your studio. I'm really excited to chat with you a bit more about this.
Yeah, so I think to start off with, what we really want to be covering is what's the difference, right? What's the difference between a pivot and a rebrand? Because they're really different. They're different things. So firstly, a pivot is more of a change in strategy. So within your business. So it might be changing the modality, the model that you offer, your target audience, those changes to the actual business and the structure versus a rebrand, which is much more is the look and feel, what your brand stands for, not necessarily just, your logo and the creative, but all of those kind of that aesthetic side of it, the look and feel. So 2 different things, and you're going to want to be considering them for 2 different reasons too. So first off, what are the warning signs that somebody might be kind of looking at, thinking about, oh, something's not quite working here and I want to be able to change it. So first off, one of the red flags that we might see would be real decline in member retention. So might have previously had a studio that's performing really, really well, flying. After a few years, you're seeing those member numbers declining and thinking, okay, something needs to be done here, but maybe I'm not quite sure what at the moment. Yeah, so another thing that we see studios really struggling with sometimes is confusion in the market about what they actually offer. So potentially their brand doesn't quite reflect maybe the modality or whether it's premium, does it feel a bit too budget? It's not really reflective. And what that means is it's not transferring then into sales and retention. And then another thing that we often see as a bit of a red flag is low engagement. So operations are working well, seems to have everything in place, but you're just really not getting that kind of feedback that you'd want from your clients. Can you think of any other kind of real world examples that you've seen maybe?
No, I think these are all great. And, I'm coming off of this having just fully rebranded my studio as we evolved. And listen, I took over and purchased an existing studio that kind of didn't feel like me. Mm-hmm. And we were yoga only at that point. And when I purchased it, I knew that we wanted to evolve and become multimodality. At that point, our name Yoga Riot didn't make sense. And it wasn't going to bring us the kind of client that we wanted to bring in. And so we changed our name and we changed everything, our visual identity. It was certainly a long process, but I think where we've landed is going to have us so much stronger. And look, we kept pieces of the old brand. I recognize that Riot in our name was a strong connotation and something that we had really built up in our community, and we wanted to hold that. So pivoting to Body Riot, where we could keep some of our old brand, but bring in some new pieces, felt like a good step along the way. But man, we learned a lot in the process.
Yeah. So how long did that process take from beginning to end, do you think?
Probably about a full year. And listen, I tried to start doing it myself at the start and quickly realized I was in over my head when we got to the visual identity of the studio in particular. I think it's kind of recognizing one skill set and maybe those visual pieces, that's not where I lie. And so, outsourcing that, hiring an agency was a massive help. But through that, I think you have to really lean into what are my core mission, vision, and values? What am I trying to convey? Really almost diving back deep into your business plan to get to the end game of your visuals, your identity is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the key thing here is rebranding is not something to undertake lightly. And you're saying that this is potentially a year-long undertaking. It has a big impact because it's not just what your website looks like. It might be your merch. It's what does your studio branding on the outside look like. It's how your members refer to you, your emails. Like it affects so many elements, and getting it right is incredibly important. Having been through several rebrands before in my marketing career, it's always like a more lengthy process than you might think, but getting it right can have a real impact, direct impact on sales. And so I'm going to cover a little bit later on how to go about that and how to know like when a rebrand might be right for you. We've kind of seen some interesting statistics recently. So coming out of Wellness Co-Creative 2024, showing that actually 1 in 3 boutique studios that rebranded saw measurable growth within 6 months of rebranding. So this is not to say this is going to be a magic pill that is going to suddenly like have a huge impact on your business. It is slow, steady, but it can have a significant impact. So let's talk a bit about kind of the pivoting side then. We've covered the highlights of rebranding. What kind of might a pivot potentially look like?
Yeah, I think you highlighted it well at the beginning. This is really a spectrum from pivoting to rebranding. And listen, a pivot could be simple. Maybe we're going to switch from a class package model to a membership. And yes, that's simple in the grand scheme, but there's a lot of things that need to happen to execute that effectively. Maybe we're changing our offering. You know, I've certainly seen this with some cycle studios that used to be performing really highly and are now seeing that modality maybe has had a tougher time, and we need to differentiate and bring more things in. But how do we do that while staying true to our brand?
Yeah, absolutely. I know from having been in the fitness industry for such a long time, we've seen different modalities come and go. There are fads and there are kind of real kind of passions for particular modalities that then end up ebbing away. And then we are seeing brands that need to be able to adapt to that. And seeing also a difference potentially when expanding, that it could be that one particular location actually is not going to be the same fit as your previous location, and you maybe need a slight pivot in what you're offering there. So I've got that. The other thing that might cause you to kind of consider a pivot is new competitors coming in. Now, our first piece of advice always with like what happens when a competitor opens is don't panic about this. This is not necessarily a bad thing, and it definitely doesn't mean that you need to go and rip up your whole business model at all. But it could mean that actually this is an opportunity for you to like reconsider your business structure and start thinking about how a smart pivot might really help you keep ahead of that competition. So competition. And then the other thing as well is just the member needs evolving themselves. So demographic change. You may well see like areas of particular population growth, or as you're kind of having younger people and younger generations coming in and entering your kind of target market, what maybe worked for millennials doesn't necessarily work for Gen Z, for example, and being open to that need to change. So this is really where understanding your target market and your customer segment is really important, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think looking at how, your clients evolve the longer they stay with your studio. I mean, if we're doing our job right, they should be gaining strength and improving. And maybe, I think of myself as a movement junkie, like my needs and my desires in fitness have changed over time. And man, if I could find a studio that can kind of eloquently keep me on that track, that's wonderful. And when I think of my studio, we looked at the main reason of cancellations being injury, and that triggered us to bring in physical therapy to kind of keep our members in-house. But again, then our name didn't make sense. And so how do we do this in a really smart way while educating our clients along the way so we don't kind of alienate the ones who have been with us for a long time?
Yeah, that's right. So it's really focusing on like knowing your core audience. Spend time with them. Like you can actually interview them. People love to talk. They love to be asked questions about themselves. And it's a real opportunity to kind of delve into insights about your business that you might not have had otherwise. So definitely recommend that. Just grabbing a coffee after class, having those conversations, really, really helpful. So let's go back to rebranding and say we made the decision, like this is definitely going to happen. I'm in need of a rebrand. Like I know that this doesn't kind of quite reflect my service anymore. You mentioned before about like the starting point really being about this understanding of like what the core vision values of the business are, making sure that that it aligned. When you were working with the agency, how did that work? Was that work that you'd done in-house yourself, and you'd kind of come up with that work on the vision and values, and then kind of given them your your vision and thoughts, or were they involved in the process?
Yeah, definitely a mix of both. I had at that point just spent all of this time detailing out a fresh new business plan. And so I felt like I had a lot of detail on what the business was and what it needed to evolve to. And then, I was met with a series of questions from the branding agency that made me look at my business in such a more kind of eagle-eyed sense. And I think I gave them a 30-page document of everything that we wanted it to be and wanted it to feel like. And I think there's a piece where again, it's like recognizing your strengths. I knew what I wanted and didn't want. And so I think you have to get very clear when you start working through the iterations on the visuals that you're given for your logo, your colors, whatnot. This is going to stick with you for a long time, and getting clear on how to deliver that feedback. I found it was really tricky to kind of find the words to articulate why or why I didn't like these things. And that was an interesting thing to work through.
Yeah, and that's absolutely like where your instinct as a studio owner is really important, because you know what your brand it should stand for, and it should feel like that kind of gut instinct that it's right for you. It's also, I think, where going out and surveying and putting some ideas in front of either members or members of the general public if you're testing concepts. So, for example, in the past, I've had to undergo like a name change alongside a rebranding. So sometimes this happens for reasons like it could be that like trademarks, or you're expanding to another country and you can't use the same name. And so I've had to undergo this kind of several times. And in that case, what we would do is put multiple names and brands in front of either an online audience that we'd kind of paid to be able to answer surveys, or our own members, and ask them to give feedback. And often the ones that we thought would win, the ones that we liked the most, actually weren't. Or what it did is it uncovered associations that we would never have thought of, but that were quite negative for some people. So an example would be one of the previous brands I worked with had the name Electric in the brand name. We all thought it was really cool, and it had loads of like cool like lightning-based designs. And actually, for a lot of people, they were thinking that sounds painful. And yeah, you feel okay, yeah, fair enough. I can see why they thought that, but because us within our bubble were so used to talking about it in that way, we didn't see like necessarily the negative side. And so getting your brand out in front of people, showing people, getting them to choose either or. It's not just to say, oh, do you like this design? But okay, here's two, which do you prefer? This one. Okay, here's another two, which do you prefer? And like getting to that point of like understanding why and what's going to resonate with your audience, like really, really important.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful to kind of go into this process. If you are undertaking a rebrand, know that there's going to be a lot of iteration here. I think that some of us have the expectation, especially if we're paying a good amount of money for this agency that's going to be working, that we're going to get something that's going to just resonate immediately. And so often it does take a lot of trial and error. And I found the process like of coming up with a new name too similar to naming a child. Of like you start to realize all of these secret connotations that everyone has with it, and you're like, oh, I didn't even think about that.
Exactly. And then all the good ones are gone as well.
Yeah.
You can't even choose to come up with something original. It's a real challenge. Definitely. There's some other practical tips I say to think of when you're undergoing a rebrand, and that's think about all the places that your logo and your brand shows up and the formats it needs to work in. So for example, if you have merch with like small logo on that's going to have embroidery detailing, you want to make sure that the logo works in that kind of format. Often things that look really good when they're kind of blown up large, as soon as you're looking at that on a smaller scale, the detail gets lost. So definitely would recommend thinking about where you want the logo to be showing up and where you want your brand to be showing up. And at that very kind of smaller scale, as well then as your shop front, which is so important to be getting right, and what your signage is going to show up like. So
yeah, and I think thinking through, how does this extend to the experience in studio and how everything's going to be portrayed, the way everything's going to present on my website, the way I'm naming my class formats. Like I think we often get stuck at logo and colors, but our brand is so much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Even to go as far as like scent, and like I think that sense is just so important. You walk through the door of the studio, like studios that have got their signature scent, or it evokes a memory, and it's a real part of how people associate with their brand. So it's just like one small touch point that's okay, well, if this is what our brand stands for, like, what kind of thing do we want people to be smelling when they walk through? What do we want our front desk staff to be saying? Like, what's on brand there? That there are so many different elements that it all kind of feeds into, aren't there?
Yeah. And I think, as we talk through all of these pieces, there's some places we could misstep, and a poorly executed rebrand could be really detrimental to your business. What are some of the risks we might see, and how do I mitigate those?
Yeah. So, as we said, don't rush into this lightly. One of the things potentially is confusing your loyal members. So people who are used to calling you a particular name, seeing your brand, love your branding, maybe wearing your merch, to undergo a rebrand really without maybe explaining them to them why can sometimes be quite jarring for them, and they don't understand the point of it. The other more practical one as well is think about how your brand's showing up like digitally, because you will have built up some brand equity over time in terms of search. So people searching for your brand name, articles pointing to you, various ways that people are speaking about you online, that is a potential risk. There are relatively simple ways to move over. So say you change your brand name, you can keep your Google reviews. There are ways to maintain that brand equity, but it has to be done in the right way. And if you don't follow the right processes, there's potential, say, to kind of lose all of those great reviews you've built up. So make sure you approach like the digital side of it with care, with caution, I would say. So kind of think through that whole process of all of those places that your brand shows up.
Yeah. And I think, what I learned was a big key here was communication. Communication not only with my team, so they understood exactly why and how we were going to do this, but also with clients, especially if you have those loyal clients who have been with you for, when I think of my studio, a decade. It was a big shift and we don't want to lose them. So how do we get them to evolve with us? And it was a lot of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you know when you were ready to change the brand? You said it seemed quite straightforward and that the decision had to be made because you didn't want to be purely yoga, but
yeah, I mean, that was simply it, is I knew that when I took over the studio, we were going to do something bigger, and the expansion was always going to be multimodality and recovery and so much more. And so we had to pivot, but I was so passionate about that and the vision that I had, and I started filtering that down to my team from the day I took it over. So even though it took us a couple years to get to the point where we had executed this, I had filtered that passion down and everyone was on board and excited too, which is ideal.
Yeah, great. So to summarize, we definitely want to make sure that there's buy-in from the whole team before going ahead, that you've got that clear vision and direction, and that there's also like data backing the need for the change. So in your case, there was clear data because you needed to make sure that it was properly reflective of the modalities. In other people's cases, it may well be looking at search trends, for example, what people are looking for in your area, how your brand is currently performing online, because then that will also help you measure the impact when you do make the change to make sure that it was all worth it.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, maybe this conversation has sparked my idea to think about a pivot or a rebrand. What are some takeaways? How should I kind of start executing this and dive deeper?
Yeah, great. So I'd start off with a basic checklist. So number one is are you aligned with your ideal client? So with your ideal client, we mean like your avatar, of which you may have between kind of 3 and 5, but they're your target audience. Is what you're offering right for them? Is it what they're looking for and what they aspire to? And is the way that your brand shows up right for them and appealing to them? So that would be the first point. Second is thinking about like the competitive landscape as a whole and how you can show up as different there. Are your offerings differentiated enough? And if not, what you can do. And then thirdly, is your brand telling the right story? So for what you want to be showing up in your community for, how you want people to be talking about you, is it currently ticking those boxes, or are there things that you can be doing to invest in to make that better?
Amazing. Well, I think what I understand from you is we need strategy behind this.
Absolutely.
We need to be proactive. Let's not reactively decide tomorrow we're going to change everything about our brand. That's not going to go well for us.
Exactly. Yeah. Take it with caution and do database decisions. And good luck if you are considering a pivot or rebrand. We'd love to hear from you. Do let us know, drop a comment to us, get in contact. Yes, and good luck with your next steps. Thanks so much for joining us on the Business of Boutique Fitness podcast.